Fire, Captain. Engineering. Situation critical.
All available personnel on the double. Spock with me.
Imagine pitching a network executive on a show about a racially mixed crew, a half-alien officer with no emotions, and a teleportation device that breaks apart human bodies on purpose, in 1966, in the middle of the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement. It sounds impossible. It almost was. What you're about to hear are 20 stories from behind the scenes of the original Star Trek that most fans have never heard. Stories about a captain who was almost someone else entirely, a kiss the network tried to sabotage, and a spaceship model that was never finished on the bottom because nobody thought anyone would look. None of this was supposed to work. A science fiction show with a tiny budget, an unproven cast, and ideas that made network censors nervous had every reason to disappear after a single season and never be spoken of again. Instead, it became one of the most influential pieces of popular culture of the last century, shaping everything from real-world technology to the language we use to talk about heroism, sacrifice, and the future. The gap between how modest this production actually was and how enormous its legacy became is exactly what makes these 20 facts worth knowing. Let's get into it. Before William Shatner ever set foot on the bridge of the Enterprise, the role of the ship's captain belonged to a different actor entirely. Gene Roddenberry's first pilot for the show, titled The Cage, starred Jeffrey Hunter, an actor best known at the time for playing Jesus in a major Hollywood biblical epic, as Captain Christopher Pike. Hunter's Pike was quiet, introspective, and heavy with the weight of command, a very different energy from the captain audiences would eventually come to know. After that first pilot, Hunter chose not to continue with the series. The exact reasons have been debated for decades. Some accounts point to family pressure, others to Hunter simply wanting to focus on film rather than television. But whatever the cause, the door was open for someone else. When William Shatner took the chair, he brought a punchier, more emotionally expressive style, and the show's entire personality shifted around him. Sadly, Hunter passed away just a few years later, in 1969, at only 42 years old, without ever seeing what the franchise would become. It's a strange thing to sit with. An actor walks away from a role because it doesn't feel right for him at that moment in his career, and that single decision ends up reshaping the DNA of a franchise that would still be running nearly 60 years later. Had Hunter stayed, Star Trek might have kept its more brooding, philosophical tone from The Cage and never developed the sharper, more emotionally reactive dynamic between Kirk, Spock, and Dr. McCoy that so much of the show's chemistry depended on. Sometimes the biggest turning points in entertainment history aren't dramatic events at all. They're quiet, personal choices made by people who had no idea how much weight those choices would eventually carry. The Vulcan we all recognize, pale, logical, with a faint greenish tint to his skin, was not the character Gene Roddenberry originally described on paper. In his early concept notes, Spock was imagined with a much more striking, reddish complexion, closer to a devilish or demonic look than the composed science officer we know. That idea ran into a very practical wall. In 1966, the majority of American households still owned black and white television sets. A deep red skin tone would have registered on those screens as an unsettlingly dark, almost black shade, which risked making Spock look monstrous rather than alien and intriguing. The production team adjusted course, landing on a subtler yellow-green tone that read as otherworldly in color but stayed neutral in black and white. Ironically, once color broadcasts became standard, the tint was so faint that most casual viewers never even registered his skin as green. It was the ears, the eyebrows, and the deadpan delivery that did the real work of making Spock feel alien. Ask a Star Trek fan to name the show's most iconic invention, and the transporter usually wins. The notion of scanning a person down to their atoms and reassembling them somewhere else feels like the height of imaginative science fiction writing. The truth is far less romantic. The production's original plan involved landing a full-sized shuttlecraft on alien worlds every time the crew needed to reach a planet's surface, complete with descent shots, exterior views, and a physical landing sequence. That would have looked terrific on screen, and it also would have devoured a budget the show simply didn't have. Under pressure to find something cheaper, the effects team landed on a solution that involved filming glittering particles falling in front of a black backdrop, then running that footage in reverse and layering it over the actors fading in and out. It cost next to nothing compared to a shuttle sequence, and it became one of the single most recognizable pieces of technology in science fiction history, a full-blown pop culture icon born entirely out of financial necessity. What's remarkable is how much creative mileage the writers eventually got out of that cost-cutting shortcut. Because the transporter could fail, malfunction, or be sabotaged, it opened up an entire category of story possibilities that a simple shuttle landing never could have offered. Characters split in two, matter streams lost in space, and dramatic last-second rescues. A device invented purely to save money ended up generating some of the show's most memorable plot lines, and decades later, real physicists still get asked in interviews whether transporter-style teleportation could ever exist. It's exceptionally rare for a network to give a failed pilot a second chance. Star Trek is one of the few shows in television history that got exactly that. When the cage was delivered to NBC executives in 1965, the reaction was blunt. The story was too slow, too thoughtful, and lacking the kind of punchy action executives wanted from a weekly adventure series. There was also discomfort at the network level with the ship's second-in-command, a calm, authoritative female officer played by Majel Barrett, a character many executives of that era simply weren't comfortable putting front and center. Rather than shelving the whole project, NBC took an unusual step and commissioned a second pilot. Roddenberry restructured the crew, dropped the original first officer concept, and introduced the dynamic between Kirk and Spock that would define the series. The footage from that first rejected pilot didn't go to waste either. Years later, it was reworked into a two-part episode called The Menagerie, which went on to win a Hugo Award, making a rejected pilot into award-winning television. For 1960s American television, simply having Nichelle Nichols on screen as Lieutenant Uhura was groundbreaking. She played a black woman in a position of real authority on the bridge of a starship, treated by the show as an equal among her crewmates rather than a background character. After the first season, though, Nichols felt pulled toward other opportunities and had already begun preparing to leave the show for a career on Broadway. Everything changed at an NAACP fundraising event, where she found herself face-to-face with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who told her directly that her role mattered far more than she realized. He explained that for the first time, children across the country, of every background, could watch television and see a black woman portrayed as a skilled professional working alongside her peers at the highest levels of human achievement. Moved by that conversation, Nichols withdrew her resignation the very next day, and she spoke for the rest of her life about that meeting as one of the most defining moments of her career. Today, it's almost impossible to separate Leonard Nimoy from the character of Spock, but early in production, Nimoy himself wasn't convinced the role would work. His hesitation centered on the physical design. The pointed ears and the alien skin tone worried him. He was concerned that rather than reading as a compelling, sympathetic character, Spock might come across as a cartoonish monster, and that he'd end up typecast in a costume rather than respected as an actor. There was also an internal challenge. Nimoy had trained as an expressive performer, and Spock demanded the opposite, a character who suppressed nearly all visible emotion. Learning to convey depth through restraint rather than expression required him to fundamentally rework his acting instincts. Audiences ended up doing the opposite of what he feared. Instead of seeing a monster, they saw warmth hiding beneath logic, and depth beneath the stillness. Nimoy's own relationship with the character is neatly summarized by the titles of his two memoirs. The first called I Am Not Spock, and years later, the second called I Am Spock. That shift in title, decades apart, tells a story all on its own. Early in his career, Nimoy seemed almost defensive about being reduced to a single role, worried that audiences and casting directors alike would never see him as anything else. By the time he wrote the second book, he'd clearly made peace with it, framing Spock not as a limitation but as something closer to a lifelong creative partner. Few actors in television history have had that complicated, evolving relationship with a single character documented so openly, in their own words, across two separate books written years apart. The kiss shared between Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura, which aired in November of 1968, is frequently cited as one of the first interracial kisses shown on American primetime network television. Far less well-known is how hard NBC pushed to prevent that moment from landing the way it did. Network executives insisted the scene be rewritten so the kiss appeared to be forced on the characters by telekinetic aliens, rather than something the two characters chose freely. A framing designed to give more conservative affiliate stations, particularly in the South, a built-in excuse to explain the moment away as alien mind control rather than genuine attraction. Shatner and Nichols reportedly worked around this by repeatedly flubbing the alternate takes where their faces stayed apart, which eventually forced the director to use the take where the two of them turned toward each other. Nichols later described receiving a letter from a white viewer in the South who said the moment had genuinely challenged his own prejudices. A reminder that a few seconds of television can carry more weight than anyone on set expected. What makes this story even more striking is how small the actual physical moment was. It wasn't a long romantic scene, it wasn't dwelt on for minutes at a time, and the story around it gave the network its built-in excuse. But television reaches people in their living rooms, in front of their families, in a way that feels personal and unavoidable, and for some viewers in 1968, simply seeing two characters they already respected choose to be close to one another was enough to shift something in how they saw the world. It's a good example of how a show built on a tight budget and constant network interference still managed, in small moments, to do something genuinely significant. Star Trek was never a ratings juggernaut during its original network run. After its first season, NBC was already openly discussing cancellation, and the murmurs grew louder heading into the second season. What happened next had almost no real precedent in television at the time. Viewers organized on a massive scale. Writing campaigns generated an enormous volume of mail to network offices. Students circulated petitions on college campuses, and fans staged demonstrations outside NBC's own headquarters. All of this happened without the internet, without social media, and without any of the tools we'd consider standard for fan mobilization today. It worked, not once but twice. NBC renewed the show for both a second and a third season, reportedly even announcing the third season renewal publicly at a fan convention. That third season ended up underfunded and buried in an unfavorable Friday night timeslot, and the show was ultimately canceled in 1969, but it had produced just enough episodes to enter television syndication, which is where its real cultural life would begin. Looking back, this campaign is often cited as one of the earliest large-scale examples of organized fan activism influencing a major media company's decisions. There was no email, no hashtag, no viral video to spread the message overnight. Every letter had to be written by hand, stamped, and mailed, which makes the sheer volume of correspondence NBC received even more remarkable. It set a template that fans of other struggling shows would try to replicate for decades afterward, though few campaigns before or since have matched the scale or the eventual payoff of what Star Trek fans managed to pull off twice in a row. The USS Enterprise, registry number NCC 1701, remains one of the most recognizable fictional spacecraft ever created. The physical filming model used to represent the ship, however, had a shortcut built into its construction that the cameras were never meant to expose. Built at roughly 11 feet long, the model was carefully detailed and painted on every surface the camera was likely to capture: the hull, the nacelles, the saucer section. The underside of the ship, though, was left largely unfinished, with bare and unpainted patches in places no shot was ever composed to reveal. Since every scene was framed from above or from the side, there was no practical reason to spend time or money finishing a surface the audience would never see. That original model is now preserved at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, a quiet monument to just how resourceful the production had to be. The USS Enterprise, registry number NCC 1701, remains one of the most recognizable fictional spacecraft ever created. The physical filming model used to represent the ship, however, had a shortcut built into its construction that the cameras were never meant to expose. Built at roughly 11 feet long, the model was carefully detailed and painted on every surface the camera was likely to capture: the hull, the nacelles, the saucer section. The underside of the ship, though, was left largely unfinished, with bare and unpainted patches in places no shot was ever composed to reveal. Since every scene was framed from above or from the side, there was no practical reason to spend time or money finishing a surface the audience would never see. That original model is now preserved at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, a quiet monument to just how resourceful the production had to be.